Whenever I find myself in a debate with a theist, which, believe it or not, is quite often, one of the first things I find myself explaining is that contrary to what they've just called me, I'm not a professional atheist. I'm as much a professional atheist as I'm a professional non-stamp collector. Now this tends to both annoy and confuse the theist, because in their mind, at least in most cases, an atheist is someone who asserts that no gods exist. But in my mind, and in the mind of most self-described atheists, an atheist is someone who simply isn't convinced by the claims of theism. The problem, of course, is that the difference between these two definitions is paramount. It's the difference between making an assertion and not, between having a burden of proof and not. This is the atheist's burden of proof, debunked. So let's begin by clearly defining theism, atheism, and the burden of proof, starting with the latter because why the hell not? Whether we're in the context of philosophy or law, the burden of proof is defined as the obligation to prove one's assertion. If you assert something, anything, then guess what? You've just incurred a burden of proof, and it doesn't matter if you've posed it in the positive, such as I have a pet bearded dragon, or in the negative, such as I don't have a pet lion. If you've made an assertion, you have the obligation to prove it. Simple stuff, right? Moving on, theism is defined as the belief that at least one god exists, and so a theist is someone who believes that at least one god exists. There are of course other definitions, but this is the generally accepted. It's not controversial. The definition of atheism, however, as alluded to in the intro, is controversial, because it's defined by theists and self-described agnostics as the belief that there are no gods, and by self-described atheists as a lack of belief in gods.
The best definition I've found for atheism is it is not a denial of gods, it is a lack of belief in gods. This is an incredibly important distinction to make.
All atheism is a lack of a belief in a particular deity, chiefly due to lack of evidence.
Atheism is non-belief in the existence of a deity. It doesn't make assertions, and it doesn't in any way address knowledge. Non-belief is the default position until the burden of proof is met.
Atheism is a lack of belief in gods.
The definition of atheist is a person who lacks belief or does not believe in God, period.
I try to clarify this to people who are under the impression, usually with negative connotations, that, oh, atheists think they know there's no God. But really, I really subscribe to the parsing of that, which is that that's not the case. What it is that it is unreasonable for me to believe that there is a God.
Now, I personally prefer to define an atheist as someone who isn't convinced by the claims of theism, because, in short, I think that the word lack implies that something's missing. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to use, unless otherwise stated, the definition that most self-described atheists adhere to. Someone who lacks a belief in gods. Anyhow, with these definitions in mind, let's make this as simple as possible. It's either the case that at least one god exists, that is, that theism is true, which we represent as P, or it's not the case that at least one god exists, that is, that theism is false, which we represent as not P. Now, as soon as someone asserts P, that theism is true, they incur a burden of proof, because they've made an assertion and consequently must now prove it. And, typically, that's what an atheist will ask them to do. In response, the theist, typically, then presents at least one argument. For example, the watchmaker analogy, which logically speaking translates to P because of X, that at least one god exists because the watchmaker analogy is valid. From here, the atheist examines X, if they haven't already, and subsequently states that it's invalid, but here's where things get a little confusing. Once the atheist asserts, in this case, that the watchmaker analogy is erroneous, they too incur a burden of proof. They incur the burden to prove not X, but they don't incur the burden to prove not P. And this distinction is the heart of the confusion. You see, if atheism is defined, as the opponents of atheism insist on, the belief that there are no gods, then in this scenario we can't call the atheist an atheist at all, because they didn't, in any way, assert that it's not the case that at least one god exists. But if atheism is defined, as most self-described atheists insist on, a lack of belief in gods, then in this scenario the atheist is an atheist, and they don't have the burden to prove not P. And so what I'm saying here is that whether or not atheists inherently have a burden of proof depends entirely on how atheism is defined. And since it stands to reason that those who self-describe as an atheist get to define their own position, ergo, atheists don't inherently have a burden of proof. Capiche? Why do you get to define what an atheist is? Don't tell me I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic. But Steve, the majority of people don't define atheism this way. Don't you get it? In academic philosophy, atheism is defined as the belief that no gods exist. My church says that atheism is... Look, I get it. I've read through your comments on my David Mitchell video. There's many definitions of atheism, and I don't get to decide which one is valid. But remember, words are not authorities, they're tools of communication, and so what matters is what people are trying to communicate. And so, again, since most self-described atheists define their atheism not as the belief that no gods exist, but as a lack of belief in gods, they, say it with me kids, don't inherently have a burden of proof. Capiche? Okay, now that this is settled, it's done. I want to conclude by clearing up one more thing. If, as I've unfortunately witnessed a few times, an atheist was to say that because X is false, P is also false, then he or she would be committing a fallacy, because he or she would be asserting that because an argument for a proposition is false, so too is the proposition. Now the reason I bring this up is because regardless to how someone defines their atheism, if they assert or infer that no gods exist, then they do indeed have a burden of proof, and so this is worth watching out for. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view. An extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have donated via PayPal, and a further special thank you to Ozymandias Ramses II for taking the time to discuss this topic with me. Cheers, sir. I thoroughly enjoyed and appreciated our conversation. Thank you. Stay rational, my fellow apes. Stay rational.